Welcome to the AALS Hot Topics program, what the 2020 election means for the movement to end the war on drugs. Thank you for joining us. I'm very excited and very grateful, especially to Alex Kreit, who's one of our panelists, for putting this together. It seems, in fact, somewhat fitting for us to have this panel while we still await one more set of election 2020 results coming out of Georgia. Gosh knows this year has been full of uncertainty and dare I say haze around our elections. And though so much was hazy, particularly on election night 2020, there were many who were saying there was one clear victor. BuzzFeed, in their headline, put it the next morning that the real winner of the election, drugs. That's, of course, because marijuana reform ballot measures passed comfortably in nearly every state in which it was up, including conservative states like Mississippi, Montana, and South Dakota. Oregon became the first state in the nation to decriminalize all drug possession and also to legalize at the statewide level so-called magic mushrooms for therapeutic purposes. As another headline stated from an NBC News commentary piece that week, 2020 election results prove America's war on drugs is finally ending. But is the drug war actually ending? And what would that quite mean? The goal of this panel is to start unpacking some of these election results and really seeking a deeper understanding of what the success of drug policy reform efforts meant in the 2020 election. And because we have a terrific panel, I'm not going to waste a lot of time introing the event or even each of them. I'm going to name the speakers quickly with their basic titles and then ask them to sort of introduce their role in this universe as they go to speak. First and foremost, like I said, I introduce myself. I'm Doug Berman. I'm a professor at The Ohio State University Moritz College of Law. I also run a center that focuses on these sets of issues, the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center. Then we're going to start with Tamar Todd, who's a lecturer at Berkeley Law and also a legal scholar with legal director at New Approaches PAC. Then Deborah Ahrens is going to follow her. She's a professor at Seattle University School of Law. Alex Kreit, who I mentioned before, will then speak. He's professor at Northern. And last but certainly not least, Shailene Title, who's just finished her term as Cannabis Control Commissioner for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I've asked each of them to talk for about 5 to 10 minutes, after which I have a few prepared questions, but I'd be eager to shelve those questions if I get good questions in the chat or Q&A. So please use that function if you can to suggest questions for the panelists after we hear from each of them with their prepared remarks. And with that, Tamar, take it away.
Thank you so much, Doug, and for the organizing of this panel. I'm excited to be here. As Doug mentioned, I'm the legal director for an organization called New Approach PAC, which has pulled together and worked on a number of the state ballot initiative campaigns. And I also work on state legislation in the area of drug policy reform for a number of nonprofit organizations, including the Drug Policy Alliance. And this last cycle, I was involved in the drafting and political campaigns for a number of the initiatives that passed. So to me, the 2020 election results and the ballot initiatives that won really underscore the importance that state ballot initiatives and direct democracy have played in challenging the war on drugs over the last 20 years. To me, that's where a lot of the pressure point has started. A lot of the reform has happened, and then it's challenged state legislatures to enact further reforms and is increasing pressure on the federal government to change its approach to drugs and drug policy. And I think the state initiative process has been so powerful for two fundamental reasons. One is that public opinion is really far off from where many elected officials are when it comes to drug policy. And that is across political party, across age, across states. Voters are much more willing to reject at this point in time the war on drug ideology and to try a new approach. And secondly, states actually have incredible amount of power when it comes to drug policy because they carry out the vast majority of drug law enforcement on the ground, especially when it comes to low-level arrests and prosecutions. And they also bear much of the public health costs of criminalizing people who use drugs. So they're motivated to adopt a new, more workable approach. and people within states see the opportunity there. And the reality with our federal system that if the states don't want to do it anymore and aren't willing to expend their resources and time, it's actually not very easy for the federal government to either force the states to do it or to step in and play that massive role in terms of enforcing. So they actually have a great amount of power, and the direct democracy allows people to exercise that power. Two significant things happened in 2020, I think, that showed the continuing power and I guess the increasing opportunity of state ballot initiatives and direct democracy. The first Doug mentioned is that voters in conservative red states adopted pretty broad marijuana law reform in significant ways that had been embraced previously by more liberal states. South Dakota legalized on the ballot both medical marijuana access and amended its constitution to allow for recreational access and to reduce penalties for marijuana possession in the face of just complete opposition by state electeds and the governor and law enforcement in that state. Montana and Arizona both legalized marijuana for adult use, and Mississippi legalized medical marijuana, with voters actually rejecting a more conservative medical initiative put on the ballot by state lawmakers. And this underscores the reality that public opinion across the board, Republicans, conservatives, overwhelmingly embrace reform in the medical marijuana context, and also embrace legalization by majorities of voters. And I think we'll continue to see in the next election cycle states like Oklahoma and Missouri adopt further reform. So I think that was a real rebuke from all states across the political spectrum and voters of the war on drugs as it's been framed by the federal government, and a real departure from federal policy and a deepening of the challenge to the war on drugs. The second thing that was very significant in 2020, and Doug also mentioned this, was that Oregon, a state that moved early on marijuana, adopted two new policies for the first time we've seen states adopt those policies via ballot initiative that take us even farther from the war on drugs and deepen that challenge in significant ways. The first was Measure 109, which creates a program for therapeutic access to psilocybin. No state has done that before. And the second is Measure 110, which is really broad and groundbreaking and decriminalizes the possession of all drugs in Oregon and redirects funding to treatment and recovery services. So we now see the adoption of these models that have existed for a period of time in conservative states, and then the adoption of new models and new policies pushing the envelope even further in places like Oregon that were early reformers on marijuana. And then and will both serve, I think, as models for other states to follow as they roll it out. And then I'll just note two challenges, I guess, that I see emerging out of these elections, and then I'll pass it on back to Doug. And the first is on Measure 110. Implementation will be very challenging on Measure 110. One, it's a very complicated process to shift an entire system of how you approach a huge public health policy problem to a new system and a new approach. And there's just increasing difficulties every day dealing with public health around people who use drugs, not the least of which is COVID, which is causing more isolation, more barriers to service, and increasing overdoses. So it will be challenging to implement that and to measure the outcomes given the increasing and continual bombardment of new problems and challenges. And then the second, the reform in red states, when the institution of the state and the electeds are opposed to it, can be difficult. There's court challenges brought by individuals in South Dakota, Montana, and Mississippi to the victories there already. Interestingly, the state is actually pretty vigorously defending the policies that the voters adopted. So even though the Secretary of State was maybe not supportive, is actually mounting a fairly robust defense. But still, you're in the face of implementing a law that the voters clearly want, but the institutions of the state have been opposed to. And we see that as a challenge of moving forward in conservative states. Nebraska Supreme Court actually removed a medical marijuana initiative from its ballot prior to the election, and a very hostile decision by a hostile Supreme Court. So I'll leave it there. Those are the two real significant things I see about the 2020 elections, and some of the challenges that are facing the outcome of them.
Thank you so much, Tamar, and we may come back to you for some other broad looks as we get into the Q&A and the discussion, but now we'll turn to Deborah, who I think is going to drill in a little bit more on marijuana issues.
Okay, and give me 1 second here as I hopefully get my screen up. All right, everyone see that? So my name is Deborah Ahrens, and I am a professor at Seattle University School of Law. Prior to being a professor here, I was a public defender and also worked at what was then the ACLU's National Drug Policy Litigation Project. And so I primarily write about drugs. I write a little bit about policing and parenting, but primarily about drugs. And while I'm sure many of you out there are motivated by much higher and finer emotions, generally when I write a project, it's sparked by rage. And so the reason that I have this cover slide up is that I've been following marijuana legalization across states. And it's true, we've been legalizing basically every year since 2012 when we legalized here in the state of Washington. A new state or a few new states have legalized marijuana, few recreationally, more for medical purposes. And at the same time, right, people are making a great deal of money now off of the new legalized industry. States are raking in a lot of tax revenue off of the industry. And some folks are getting to open. They're kind of Pinterest ready pot boutiques like you see here. But at the same time, you have a lot of people who were engaged in the exact same activity, the exact same industry 10, 15 years ago, who instead of getting to enter this industry, often because of their convictions, unable to enter this industry, instead continue to have their lives constrained by their criminal convictions. And so I authored a paper that came out a couple of months ago that I want to use kind of that paper in the 2020 elections to talk a little bit about how marijuana reform has kind of shifted over time, where we're doing well, I think, where we might expect marijuana reform to go, and what we might expect the Biden administration to do with the fact that we now have a lot of people who can't enter educational or housing or job opportunities because of convictions for activity that has now been formally legalized and in even more states at least decriminalized. And so, as we've already heard, support is pretty broad for marijuana legalization. At this point, 68% of Americans support legalizing it, and it commands majorities. And this is just recreational marijuana. You have higher support for medical marijuana, but this is something that commands support, which is why you're seeing states continue to legalize, and 4 new states legalized recreational marijuana in 2020. And as you've heard, this isn't just an upper left coast type of phenomenon, as you might have been able to write it off in 2012. When South Dakota decides to legalize, you have to think that this is something that enjoys broad political support. At the same time, as I said, the people who are entering this newly legalized industry, they're generally white, they're generally fairly affluent, and as this graphic kind of reminds you, it's taken from an ACLU report called Marijuana in Black and White. The majority of people who are walking around with the criminal convictions for past activities, they tend to be Black. If they're not Black, they're members of other minority groups, and they tend obviously to be much less affluent. And this isn't some sort of accident, right? It's for 2 reasons. One, the history of drug laws in general has been rooted in race. Drug laws were adopted largely for racist reasons. And then when they are enforced by people. They don't self-enforce. And so you deal with racial bias from police, from prosecutors, from judges, from defense attorneys, from every actor in the criminal justice system who enjoys discretionary authority. And those criminal convictions come with other costs other than just the incarceration or fines or community supervision that might come along with a criminal conviction. You have all sorts of other collateral consequences that I've mentioned, like barriers to employment, barriers to education, barriers to financial aid, all sorts of barriers that you face once you have these criminal convictions that continue even if your jurisdiction has legalized. And these are extensive. And one of the things that's been really interesting to watch about legalization efforts is I think historically, they largely focused on economics, which is if we legalize marijuana, we can regulate it, tax it, get a lot of money from the industry, and at the same time not spend the money on policing and incarceration and trials and all the things that are causing us to incur expenses. So really kind of the 2012 vision of legalizing marijuana is we'll make more money. But one of the shifts you've really seen, I think, in campaigns to legalize marijuana has been a shift to really recognizing the racial disparities that I've just mentioned and really focusing in legalization efforts on the fact that enforcement of drug laws tends to affect people by race, and that by legalizing marijuana, you might reduce those effects. Dishearteningly, one of the things that has come out of legalization is the realization that even once you legalize marijuana, of course, that doesn't mean all marijuana related activity is suddenly legal. And you do continue to see disparities in arrest rates for marijuana offenses, even in jurisdictions that have legalized. So legalization doesn't fix the racial disparities, but fewer people get arrested, fewer people get prosecuted, fewer people incur convictions. So that is certainly progress of that sort. So my argument has really been from the beginning that what we ought to be doing is expunging past criminal convictions in jurisdictions that have legalized. And my argument's been pretty broad. I'll put up a citation to it at the very end for those of you who are interested in burrowing in, that what we ought to be doing is not just expunging low-level possession convictions, but also felony convictions for possession with intent to distribute or distribution or even cultivation, and that we should be doing that for everyone, regardless of their criminal histories. And most importantly, that that burden should be shouldered by states. In other words, the states should take on the burden of going ahead and expunging convictions. And one of the things that's noteworthy is that in 2012, when we legalized here in Washington at the very beginning of this legalization process, we did not address any of those issues at all. It wasn't until 2018 that our governor here announced that he was going to be doing some very limited pardons for about 1,000 people who had low-level marijuana possession convictions and only low-level marijuana convictions. And now when states legalize, they tend to try to address the expungement issue right up front. Oftentimes the expungements are right there in the legislation that legalizes marijuana. And so states are now much more commonly, when they legalize, addressing expungements. Some states that haven't legalized but have decriminalized are now expunging convictions. But for the most part, states are continuing, and this was true in 2020 as well, states are continuing to put the burden on individuals who have been convicted to come forward and ask for their convictions to be expunged. They're doing a good job of setting up expungement processes that tend to be more streamlined than general expungement processes, that tend to be automatic. In other words, the language of expungement is if the person requests the expungement, they get the expungement, the judge must offer the expungement. But most states right now are still placing that burden on individuals to come forward. California and Illinois are two states that are actually taking that burden on themselves. They are actually funding the process, looking for the convictions and clearing them without the participation of people who have been convicted. And the governor of Illinois just announced last week that the state of Illinois has already cleared about 500,000 marijuana arrest records. And that's through, again, one of these automatic processes. So the last thing I want to leave you with is what President-elect Joe Biden is likely to do. And so Joe Biden, in campaigning, said expressly that he supports decriminalization of marijuana, but doesn't support legalization of marijuana. Vice President-elect Harris has said she does support legalization. Congress had, or the House of Representatives had considered legislation recently to legalize. So it's unclear to me whether or not ultimately we'll end up at a federal level with legalization. What you are likely to see is President-elect Biden has said that he will return to the kind of Obama-era Cole memo policy of not prosecuting marijuana offenses in states where marijuana has been legalized. Former Attorney General Jeff Sessions had rescinded that policy, and while I'm not aware of the Trump administration ramping up federal prosecutions of marijuana offenses in legalization jurisdictions, there was no promise that that wouldn't occur, and President-elect Biden has said that that's going to go back into place. but he's also interestingly said specific things about expungement. And this is framed in language in a speech that he gave in July of last year, where he specifically talked about those racial disparities that I brought up earlier. And he said that under his administration, one thing he plans to do is to offer to states financial incentives to go ahead and develop automatic expungement systems for low-level marijuana offenses. And again, he roots that in the need to create racial equity. So again, for those of you who might be interested in reading a little bit more about this topic, this is a citation to my recent piece. But with that, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my slides and turn it back over to Doug Berman.
Thank you so much, Deborah, and thank you to the commenter. I saw a comment that was asking about the intersection of expungement relief and voting rights, but I'm going to save and encourage more questions in the chat, but I'll save them all until the end. I want to give Alex and Shailene a chance to give their initial presentations, and so we're on to you now, Alex.
Oops, rookie mistake, forgot to unmute myself. Thanks, Doug. And I want to recommend Deborah's article, by the way. It's really, really fantastic. So I'm going to talk about the developments in Oregon and kind of expand a little bit on especially the decriminalization ballot measure, but a little bit on the psychedelic therapeutic ballot measure as well, because these, I think, are true, especially kind of groundbreaking developments in terms of sort of where we stand with the war on drugs today. And I think probably both initiatives that, even a few years ago, a lot of people would have had a hard time imagining becoming law in any state. The decriminalization ballot measure in Oregon does make it the first, does make Oregon the first U.S. state to decriminalize drugs. And it's modeled sort of loosely on a 2001 law from Portugal. Portugal decriminalized drugs in 2001, and sort of very briefly, the Portugal policy, I think most observers have, concluded has been a success. When you look at sort of public health measures following Portugal's 2001 decriminalization law, in the years since, you've seen a pretty significant drop in drug-induced deaths and drug overdose deaths, decreases in rates of past year and past month use, which are suggestive of, substance use disorder, evidence of significant decreases in other specific areas. In 2017, Portugal's health ministry estimated that heroin users had decreased from about 100,000 when the policy was put in place to 25,000 in Portugal. So, in combination with decriminalization, Portugal sort of significantly expanded access to treatment. And Oregon's ballot measure, which Tamar's already talked a little bit about, but I'll be expanding on, kind of seeks, I think, to try to implement something close to the Portugal policy, although there are, I think, some significant differences. So what it does primarily, is relatively straightforward and not surprising. To criminalize drugs, it makes drug possession, possession of small amounts of drugs, a violation with a $100 fine. This is not removing all penalties, right? It's not like it's completely legal to possess small amounts of drugs, but it sort of decriminalizes it. It makes it more akin to a traffic violation or infraction. When you're talking about small amounts of drugs, the measure specifies amounts of drugs. As an example, I believe cocaine is set at 2 grams. That's something like, from UNODC estimates, $170, $200. Retail, obviously, I do not know offhand what the retail value, dollar amount of cocaine is in Oregon right now, but UNODC estimates it at a couple $100. So you're not talking about huge amounts, but you are talking about something that's kind of akin to what you usually think of as personal use amounts of drugs. Now, a key feature in the law is that in place of the $200 penalty, or the $100 fine rather, there is the option to do a completed health assessment from a drug addiction counselor. And I think, hope and design, and this is sort of to try and make it, or something that I think is similar to, but distinct from what Portugal's law does, is to incentivize people who are found with in possession of drugs to potentially seek treatment if they are in need of treatment, right? To go and get a health assessment from a professional, have somebody assess whether they have a substance use disorder, whether they have underlying treatment needs, and ideally, if they have those treatment needs, to go and seek treatment. And in order to sort of expand access to treatment, encourage people to seek treatment and facilitate treatment, the law significantly boosts funding for treatment services in the state of Oregon. I think the state estimated that it would increase it to something over 100 million annually, from 25 million annually dedicated to substance use disorder treatment. And that money comes from savings from the decriminalization of drugs and from some of marijuana sales tax revenue. So you have a sort of substantial increase in funding. And I think that there's little reason to question this is going to have a pretty significant impact on the criminal justice system and criminal enforcement in the state. I think that the state agency estimated that this would result in a 91% estimated decrease in drug possession arrests. It won't completely eliminate drug possession arrests because there are the numeric limit, number limits on what the personal use amounts are. Possession of over those amounts is continuing to be a misdemeanor. But it's a significant drop, right, in arrests. Now, there's, I think, a very key, there are a number of distinctions between this Oregon's new law and Portugal's law. But I think one that is going to be especially interesting to see play out is kind of the distinction between incentivizing people to go and seek these health assessments and what Oregon and what Portugal does. So Portugal has, I think, probably fair to say, a little bit more of an involved or active oversight type of process for people who are found in possession of drugs. So Portugal, people who are found in possession of personal use amounts of drugs are given a summons to go to what they call a dissuasion panel. And the dissuasion panel has the option, and it's a panel sort of made up of three people, typically a couple of public health professionals and somebody with a legal background. They'll give, they'll assess the treatment needs of the person who's sent to them. They have the option to assess fines against the person if they're not complying with, the treatment recommendations, or I guess order, if you will, if they're going to be assessing penalties. And so it's a little bit more of kind of an active, carrot stick type of approach. I think Portugal's approach could be maybe likened a little bit more to the US drug court system, just in the civil setting, right? In Portugal, it's decriminalized, it's not in the criminal setting. There's no potential for criminal penalties, loss of liberty, but the dissuasion panels are operating a little bit more, like in some ways, criminal drug court does in the United States. Whereas Oregon's law, really has this sort of either or option: pay the fine or get the health assessment. And if you get the health assessment, there's not sort of the carrot stick to further incentivize treatment. And, I think certainly critics of the law, will say, well, you need to have sort of the carrot stick approach. You need to have penalties. You need to have things to incentivize treatment. I think that this ballot measure takes a view of trying to, as much as possible, have people be incentivized to self-initiate treatment and to sort of really make this as much of a public health approach as possible. Now, if this law, I think, catches on in other states, the potential impact in the criminal justice system is pretty significant. I mean, roughly, obviously it varies every year, but you're talking somewhere around 10% of arrests every year, of arrests that are tracked by the FBI's Uniform Crime Report numbers, are for simple drug possession. And so you're talking about taking a pretty significant chunk of arrests out of the criminal justice system. And you're talking about a chunk of arrests that, I think may, and obviously this is something to see, have a effect on policing more broadly. Because you look at sort of the rise of pretextual stops, the rise of invasive policing, the rise of racial profiling and stop and frisk, a lot of that is tied up into policing drug possession. And so once you decriminalize drug possession, I think it's going to be very interesting to see how that sort of changes the shape of policing more generally. And so I want to sort of end just with a very quick overview of what I think is probably, on the whole, maybe of lesser importance, but still a pretty notable development with Oregon's Measure 109, which is the psychedelic mushroom therapeutic ballot measure. And it kind of aims to be a little bit like medical marijuana or early medical marijuana laws, although operates differently in some very crucial respects. But the ballot measure effectively makes it legal or provides a legal avenue for the manufacture and distribution of use of psychedelic mushrooms, albeit unlike with medical marijuana, this ballot measure contemplates use in a very supervised setting, that the use will be occurring in a supervised setting with licensed facilitators. And this is a law that I think it's going to take a while longer for this to come online. The law gives the state 2 years to come up with regulations about how it's exactly going to be implemented. This is also a law, and I think I'll kind of leave it here, and we can get into it more in discussion or Q&A if we want, but a law where I have some real question marks about whether it's actually going to be able to be implemented, because I think the potential for federal interference here, if the federal government wants to interfere, is pretty significant, unlike Oregon's decriminalization measure, and in contrast to marijuana reforms. And we can get into sort of why that might be, but it's certainly a notable law, and it's something that I do think, and I'll close here, is suggestive of what we might see federally relatively soon for psilocybin, which is very seriously. There's, I think, a very, very realistic possibility in the next couple of years we'll see FDA approval for its use for therapeutic purposes for depression.
Thank you so much, Alex, and actually thanks to all the panelists so far, keeping pretty good on time. And so we've got plenty of time for Shailene, and then we'll get to some Q&A, and I'll have a few sort of comments towards the end as well. And so, Shailene, you've been living through this after the consequences of election 2016, and had an incredible experience on the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission. Love to hear about that experience and your perspectives on where we're all going after this election cycle.
Thank you, Doug. And thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. This is a really great lineup of people whose work I greatly respect and have been following for some time. So I am on my second day as a private citizen. I'm recovering from a 3.5-year stint as a regulator in Massachusetts. So our agency, the Cannabis Control Commission, is a independent, brand new agency that was created in 2016 when Massachusetts legalized cannabis. And we came on as 5 commissioners appointed with expertise in 5 different areas: public health, public safety, government regulation, business, and my seat, which was social justice. And we were given this task of taking the entire marijuana law and implementing it, everything from ingredients, labeling, security, tracking, to my area, which is the social justice equity area, with really very little support. I think there's a marked contrast between these later states, particularly Illinois, which has done such an amazing job in terms of equity, being the first state that has passed through the legislature and the institutional support that comes with, versus a state like Massachusetts, where we were very much on our own. So if you just take a step back, when we talk about equity in cannabis, these have all been alluded to, but I just want to make sure that I think of it as three different areas. And the first is reinvesting tax revenue into the communities that have been harmed. Again, I think Illinois has done a great job with this, and future states are definitely adding teeth and specificity to that aspect of it. The second is the criminal justice reforms, which Deborah went through beautifully. It's very often, I think, hyper-focused on expungement for some reason, and particularly low-level expungement when that's important, but there should be a lot more, including expungement of other offenses, and making sure that we're watching the racial disparities. Because as Deborah mentioned earlier, in a lot of states, the arrests go down, but the disparities even get worse, which is what happened in Massachusetts. So we want to make sure that now we have some warning that we're addressing that challenge in advance. And then the third is the economic justice, saying, okay, we've had these decades of unfairly enforced laws that have devastated different communities, had all of these effects on jobs, housing, your right to live freely, and it has hurt generations of people. So how do we make sure now that we have a $1 billion industry in Massachusetts that those communities are sharing in the profits and the economic benefits? So I was largely tasked with that, along with my peers in other states. It's a very complicated question. I can say, in general, the best measure I think that we took and the most successful was when we were listening to the communities directly. So not through lobbyists, not through filtered organizations even necessarily, but just directly hearing from people about the challenges that they were facing. Often it would be that the property was too expensive, it was zoned into some tiny place, and then they were being charged like 10 times more, and then they were paying that rent while they went through a years-long local and state process. So we would make a small change, like we would ask the localities to consider zoning with that in mind, and then we moved our application process around so that location came just at the very end. And then just taking measures like that to address all of the different challenges, because there's no real shortcut that you can take. So I formed an organization with peers from other states who were running into these same issues called the Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition. And the goal there is to have a source of expertise from the people who are doing this or have been doing this in different states, so that new jurisdictions and with federal legalization, we can learn from those examples. And I guess I'll close these opening comments with telling you what happened with that organization, because I think it's pretty demonstrative of where we are at as we look forward. So we created the organization in September when it looked like the MORE Act was about to be voted on in the fall. And we wanted our launch to be associated with that vote and to support it. So we had all of these plans, we had all these op-eds ready, and this launch to say, like, here are these regulators who support the MORE Act. It didn't get voted on, which was fine, so we put it off. Then in the last couple months when it got voted on again, we were again ready for that. And there was a last minute change, as some people who follow this closely may know, in which an amendment was added which barred people with cannabis convictions, in some cases, from entering the cannabis industry. And this is something that those of us in this movement have learned from, that was considered a grave mistake, I think, in some of the early states, or maybe a politically necessary inclusion that's now no longer necessary, because people who have cannabis convictions have the skills, and they've been unfairly enforced against by the war on drugs. They're certainly not the people that we want to be excluding. There was also an amendment that added a federal permit process. And if you're a cannabis regulator who deals with state level regulations and local regulations, you know that there is already so much disharmony between those two levels. For example, in Massachusetts, I always tell people that's the biggest mistake that we made. We painstakingly created all of these equity provisions at the state level, but every business requires some type of local approval, and there are no equity requirements at the local level. So you have local officials that don't have the time or the expertise and have all of the power, for who gets the 4 or 5 permits in that city. And so if we added a federal permit to that system, it would just be an absolute disaster. And so the 10 of us who are the founding members of this organization saw those amendments, had a complete freak out, and I'm almost kind of glad that this year, we have some time to rework the MORE Act and make sure that the expertise that we are gaining in California and Illinois and Massachusetts and other states can be reflected in new federal legislation, but then also in new states, because I see in places like New York and New Jersey that there is real political will, real bravery and courage and willingness to walk away from the table if we don't see more robust social justice provisions. And so what I think is on a lot of us who have been in the movement for a long time and learning these lessons is that we make sure that data is available and readily available for those who need it. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Doug.
Great. Thank you. And I'm pleased to see that there's 3 terrific questions in the chat now I will get to, but I want to take advantage of my moderator's privilege to highlight a point that all the comments that all were wonderful kind of reinforced for me, and also make a plug for some work I'm doing with my Drug Enforcement and Policy Center that may be of particular interest to a law professor audience. The thing I recall back to, and I give Alex credit for this as well, because it's literally 8 years ago in his doing that he put together a panel just like this as a hot topic after Washington and Colorado were the first states of the nation to pass full marijuana legalization, and he was kind enough to invite me to be part of that discussion. And I was just amazed at how many different types of legal issues necessarily intersected. And I think, Shailene, your comments especially kind of was, yet another reminder of, even one state dealing with this topic, just the marijuana topic on one frontier with full legalization, has so many things to keep in mind. And, whether it's a ballot initiative versus legislation, whether it's the work of federal actors, state actors, local actors, whether it's the public health version or vision, the criminal justice reform, the social equity and social justice questions, there's so much there, as I sometimes like to put it. And I'd kind of like to ask all of you, or just get maybe your perspectives on thinking about talking to a law professor audience who may be interested in these topics, but may not have a chance to teach a whole class on this, not even maybe be able to do a class or two in another traditional course on these sets of topics. Part one is, how would you encourage law professors maybe to get engaged in this space? What are the sort of the topics you're seeing that you might think are kind of worthy of added time and attention? And a layer of that for me, especially too, I'll be extra personal, is I have students come to me all the time, say, I think the war on drugs is terrible. We need reform. I want to do what I can. Tell me, Professor Berman, what should I work on? And I'm like, well, there's lots of things I'm interested in, but I'm trying to, sort of figure out how to convey, ideas and energy to students effectively, especially looking ahead as they imagine their careers, 3, 5, 10 years down the line, kind of where the next great frontiers are. And I look at everybody involved in this panel as themselves somewhat genius, because they're working in this space because they see and have, an incredibly insightful vision of the work that needs to be done here. But I'd love any and everybody's sort of take on, for the law professor, very interested in these issues. They must be if they've tapped into this panel, but kind of unsure, how to break into it, what topics to especially be focused on, or thinking about where the work of law professors, the interest of law students might be especially well challenged in the coming months and years. Love to hear any thoughts on that front.
I mean, I could go ahead and start. I pretty much just teach things that are related to criminal law, and that's all I write on, and criminal procedure. I actually think that for people who are interested in trying to ameliorate some of the harms of the war on drugs, legislation and regulation, those are courses and materials where a lot of the work, I think that Shailene's piece was really interesting for all of us and also indicative. A lot of the work of this is really done at the legislative and regulatory level, not at the kind of big thoughts about criminal law level. If you look at some of these initiatives, the voters basically say, yes, we would like to legalize marijuana, and that's pretty much the end of it. The actual putting that into place, trying to figure out, I mean, if you look at Illinois' state legislation legalizing marijuana, it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages long. And it deals with the kinds of things that Shailene was talking about, like providing opportunity zones and grants to people who might not have the capitalization to enter the industry, but come from various kinds of backgrounds and may have criminal convictions. And I think that for those of you for whom, or for students who are interested in this area, I think that legislation and regulation are really areas where competency is the most important.
If I could add to that, that is completely true. If you also have the capacity to work with students in a clinic setting, that can be really helpful to regulators too, in addition to the people that you're helping. Because we had some of our equity program participants in local Boston area law school clinics, and it was really marketable for the students to learn how to do cannabis business applications. And then they were also able to flag for us where the regulations could be more refined.
Yeah, I sort of echo the idea of that this is an area that I'd say almost every, maybe even every sort of specialty that somebody has, anybody in the audience who's not working in criminal justice, who's working in something else totally different, there's probably some intersection between that area and some aspect of drug policy reform at this point, particularly, with respect to cannabis legalization, because you get all of the sort of issues of the tax implications, the intellectual property implications, and all down the line. And Doug and I, we recently came out with a marijuana law casebook, and I must say it was fun, but also difficult adding in all of these pieces about areas of law that neither of us are really specialists in, but need to be that we included because of the connection of things like the tax law, environmental issues, IP, all down the line. And the other thing I would want to say is, though, and so I think, whatever sort of area of the law that you focus on, if you're interested in drug policy issues and have an inkling to maybe write a piece in this area, explore, I think there's always going to be a connection, no matter sort of what your specialty is. In terms of sort of on the teaching side, it's maybe a little bit harder depending on what classes you're teaching, to work in drug policy issues to any given class. But I would recommend certainly thinking about it. And I would especially make a plug for anybody who is teaching in the criminal law space to absolutely include coverage of drug crimes. I mean, it's kind of, I'm aware of it, but it still shocks me every time I think about how many criminal law casebooks today literally have zero coverage of drug crimes. And most leading cases do not have a chapter on drug crimes. And of course, as a result, most of us who teach criminal law don't have coverage as well. So I'd make a plug, even if the casebook used, doesn't have drug crimes, email me. I'd be happy to share suggestions for what to do for a class or two. But I think it's absolutely essential if you're teaching the criminal law space to cover drug crimes. And, there's a lot of other areas too, where I think you can get a lot of value in the classroom with a class or two devoted to coverage of drug policy issues, but criminal law especially. I think, if you're not already doing it and you're teaching criminal law, please think about making at least a class session to do it.
And I'll just add, I also agree. I think almost any legal topic, you can work marijuana and drug law in there. Even from, international law, the intersection of the treaties that we don't talk about that much, but what it means for us to be just ignoring treaties in one context and arguing that they be enforced in others has impact. Constitutional law, a lot of other countries are legalizing marijuana through constitutional law decisions and the implications there. And then I'll just add in the terms of I think broadening the view where drugs intersect with punishment more broadly, like so the intersection with immigration law, particularly the intersection with family law, and that many women are actually punished through the Child Protective Services and family law, and then also employment law. And I think, you know, it's interesting what Shailene brought up about the MORE Act, because it was internally completely inconsistent. So part of the law was to incentivize states and provide them funding to not bar people with criminal convictions from entering the industry. And then a second piece of the law was like, but you can't get the federal permit if you have a prior conviction, right? So it was, I feel like half the brain was like, right, we're undoing this wrong and we're gonna allow people entry. And then the other half of the brain went to this automatic, like, this is what we always do. Like, everyone's always barred from getting federal permits and doing taxes. And so that sense about restoring, and undoing harm has to be infused throughout all these different areas of law, or else we just go to our automatic, like what lawmakers have been doing for all these years, without intentionally thinking about how are we harming people through all these systems and how do we undo it, by weaving it in through all these other disciplines and subjects.
Wonderful, and I'm grateful, and I had an inkling there'd be lots of good answers to that question, and I'll sort of wrap it up on this frontier and then turn to the questions on the chat by highlighting this is also, I think, an incredible area for obvious reasons that probably most people know well already, but that the more you spend time on it, the richer it gets to look at some broader legal theory questions more generally, right? So whether it's a kind of level of government, are public health and drug use issues properly for the federal government or the state government or for local governments or not for government at all, and all the issues that surround those kinds of questions. What should be criminalized? What are the alternatives to criminalization, even if we want to dissuade behavior? That, to me, I think is one of the kind of most fascinating things that not only taps into kind of broader debates we have about criminal law generally these days, but really the entire structure of the relationship between the government and individuals, where it doesn't seem as though we have a model other than make it a crime and maybe enforce it or not to deal with things we don't think are good behavior, when there's lots of things that we might simultaneously want to dissuade people from doing without threatening criminal sanctions if they do, especially in a COVID world, perhaps as another way to sort of frame into that, and to particularly see where that all filters through our modern political moment, right? Where we see claims for freedom in the drug space coming generally from the left, claims for freedom in the COVID space generally coming from the right, and particularly interesting, as some of my students like to do in my marijuana seminar, is to highlight efforts to bring religious freedom to bear to justify drug use or justify marijuana activity, and whether the recent work by the U.S. Supreme Court and others to protect religious freedom in a COVID era, again, fascinating to think about, as I see it, for a lot of the stuff that lots of law professors like to think about in a variety of settings. And so that's a long-winded pitch with the help of all my panelists for a little project we have going with the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, which is building out a website and a set of materials under the label Teaching Drugs, where our goal is to help faculty and others who are interested in being involved in teaching in this space. Teaching can mean so many different things: a class, other course, an entire new kind of course, maybe a problem. We've been doing some writing competitions in this space, that it's another way to sort of introduce students and give them exposure to the sets of issues that these questions raise. And so want to encourage, as Alex did as well, folks should email me if they have thoughts or interest in working in this space. Now I'm gonna rattle off some of the questions here, although this is nice. I've seen some of the chats included banking issues, immigration, the integration with civil forfeiture, and the disparate impact on communities of color is another rich area to integrate to this discussion. So lots of folks out there very much engaged with thinking through these topics in other settings. And so thank you all of that for the questions. I've got, I think, 4 questions here. I'm gonna read them all 4 off. Hopefully those of you who have thoughts on each one can chime in sequence as appropriate, because they don't quite all intersect, but they overlap in some respects. I think I mentioned briefly before, Deborah, this may be ostensibly for you. How might this, I think this at the time was your discussion of expungement, interact with efforts to restore voting rights to former felons? which could seemingly lead to even broader support for further decriminalization initiatives. Would an expungement restore those voting rights? Would fines and fees still need to be paid to restore voting rights, right? So that's the expungement intersection with civil rights and voting rights particularly. Alex, I think you got two, although one of these might also be perfect for Shailene as well. Has there been a comprehensive report about Portugal's decriminalization since the original Cato Institute report, which I think was, a decade ago now already? Then I've got, I'm an advocate of ending the war on drugs, particularly against Blacks. Why should Blacks support, quote, legalization when that merely results in a white market for drugs? Shailene, you may want to speak to that. And then last but not least, and Tamar, you may even start here, will the federal government take marijuana off the controlled substances list? And check back after Georgia votes today would be one part of that question, I would think. But no matter how Georgia votes, I think my instinct is the question is not anytime soon, but eventually. But maybe Tamar, you have a different take on that one, and then others can chime in.
I'm sure, yeah, I was going to make the same joke that maybe the 2021 elections will be more important and seeing whether that happens or not. I think eventually, I think it's a matter of timing. I think eventually more and more states, the public opinion is shifting away. The federal law is now not being enforced in significant ways and is just serving as a barrier to like proper regulation and public health and interstate commerce and other things to have sort of a functioning system that is workable and actually meets the policy goals of federal drug control policy and the states. But I do hope, and I think what there is great potential for in the meantime is what Deborah mentioned earlier, and that's a number of steps that can happen in conjunction with decriminalization and some of the statements that President-elect Biden has already made about certainly focused on reducing the harm to individuals of the arrests. Both, I think, incentivizing states to decriminalize, but also, the immigration consequences are federal immigration consequences. Like that can be reformed for not just marijuana convictions, but drug possession convictions more broadly. There's certainly drug testing barriers, employment barriers, all sorts of places, I think, in federal law where there could be reform to just reduce the criminalization and the barriers presented to individuals who are arrested and cut off from access to treatment and other opportunities. So that I see as I'm very hopeful for in the short term. And I think the federal regulation is an eventuality, and we'll see on the time frame of that, depending on what happens today and I guess in the next 4 years.
I guess I'll go ahead and I'll take the question that was directed towards me. And the answer is, I wish I were an expert in felony disenfranchisement laws. It's kind of like, I often sit here questioning my life choices when I realize pretty much everything I research is something where 50 different states do 50 different things. And so it is a pain in the neck every time you need to research anything. And the truth is that we have 50 different states that do different things with disenfranchisement. We only have a few that don't disenfranchise anyone for their criminal convictions. On the other hand, we only have a few that ever disenfranchise people for misdemeanors, and for better or for worse. And I think Shailene is right. Most of the expungement discussion and reality right now is expunging misdemeanor offenses. And that's what I think, because that's saleable, right? People hear, oh, someone has one low-level possession conviction and now it's legalized. That's sympathetic. Somebody who is actually selling marijuana, even though, and I think Shailene is right, this is somebody who's developed expertise in the field, knows the market. That's someone who right now in California and Illinois can petition to get their felony reduced to a misdemeanor, which may be important for disenfranchisement purposes. But no jurisdiction right now is just expunging felonies upfront automatically. And so I don't actually know that expungement is going to connect that much to felony disenfranchisement. And of course, the other piece is, even to the extent that people are eligible for expungements, I am not an expert in what every state requires in terms of whether or not you've satisfied your fines and fees. A lot of the states have adopted expungement measures specific to marijuana, which, as I mentioned earlier, have automatic judge must language, but it still doesn't say judge must and necessarily limit it to cases where people have or haven't paid off their fines. So again, I don't know that that's a big piece of it at this point, but again, it's part of why I want to argue for broader expungements and sealing. There are all sorts of collateral consequences. Certainly voting rights are one of them. And the folks who have had their voting rights taken away based on marijuana convictions for the most part now aren't eligible for expungement at all.
So on the Portugal question, I'd say offhand, probably the most sort of similar to that Cato study in terms of like kind of comprehensive type review. There's a Transform organization called Transform, did a sort of 30,000 foot, I guess, kind of overview type of study a few years back. And that's probably the most similar that I recommend in terms of citing to other studies on more specific things. There have, of course, been lots of studies produced on very specific parts of Portugal's drug policy and impacts, but the Transform report, I think, is the thing I'd probably recommend for a more updated look at sort of all of those things. And the other thing I'd sort of recommend, which is not a report, but the Vox did a piece before Oregon's vote. The guy, Sherman Lopez, who covers drug policy issues for Vox, is usually really pretty good. And if I recall, I think his piece had a pretty good summary and links to a few sort of updated kind of scholarly pieces on Portugal's law. And one thing, I think to piggyback on what Tamara said, I do think it's, there's so much focus on sort of when will we get the broad scale marijuana reform, which is obviously going to be very significant and it is important. But I think, in some ways, it's maybe, one of the least important practically, because there is no federal enforcement of these legal stores right now, right? By contrast, some of the things Tamara mentioned, like, immigration consequences for drugs is a very, very, very real thing. And so while I do think federal reform of marijuana that officially acknowledges and makes, legal federally what we see at the states as far as marijuana legalization is obviously very important. I think it's just a matter of sort of, when and what will it look like, not if at this point. Some of those other things that are, just get a lot less attention, hopefully will be easier to reform. And I think if we do get those reforms, we'll have much more significant practical consequences because they are being enforced. Those immigration consequences are happening, right? And so if you can get movement on those things, which get less attention, I do think in the short term, that could be even more significant. So hopefully there will be some opportunity for at least some of those things to get some changes on federally.
So Shailene, especially since you were, working in the belly of the beast of the challenge between seeking social justice and watching an industry unfold that still seems to reflect the biases and disparities that our criminal justice system has long reflected, that our business systems have long reflected. Do you come away recovering from your 4 years depressed or enheartened? And how do we not be discouraged that these patterns just repeat themselves in different ways, even as we move forward?
Well, similar to Deborah, I'm very motivated by rage, so that has worked out well for me. So the question about why should Black people support these reforms if the results that we're seeing are not helpful? I have a political answer to that and a legal answer to that. So the political answer is, yeah, you have every right to ask that question, and you have every right to demand successful data before you're willing to support an initiative. And that is the attitude that you should have. So I was recruited to this movement 20 years ago by Students for Sensible Drug Policy, and Professor Creit was the leader at that time. And what we were working on was a change specifically to the Higher Education Act that would stop students from having their access to federal aid denied based on drug convictions. That was passed this year. And I don't say that because I'm proud that it took 20 years, but I say it to make the point that you have to set your expectations that if you work on something, you're not going to get results tomorrow. And I go out and I talk to people, and they are a little confused they're just getting used to marijuana legalization, and they're just not used to the idea of why would we want somebody with a conviction to have benefits. but then you talk to them, you explain, you appeal to their fundamental sense of fairness, and then they get it. So we need to have that conversation over and over and over for years, like we did with marijuana legalization, before people are going to get it. But we have all these different states. We have the political moment that we're in. And so it's going to pay off if we continue to fight that battle. The legal answer is that in Massachusetts, as I was working on our programs, I was not able to implement as robust provisions as I wanted, and particularly not as clearly race-based as I wanted, because we didn't have the data from the industry. And you can't clearly transfer criminal justice data to basically affirmative action laws. Now we have that data, and Massachusetts in particular has really focused on releasing it in a detailed way, and I know other states are too. And so I think there's a lot more of a chance for us to have provisions with a lot more teeth in future laws. So the answer is you should support it, but not until you're satisfied that the law looks the way you want it to. Oh, and if I may, sorry, just want to quickly agree that Transform, it's a London-based nonprofit think tank. They're on the cutting edge of drug law reform. They have a new book called How to Regulate Stimulants that I really recommend if you want to be looking at what's groundbreaking.
Yeah, I would just echo that in a sort of a broader context, which is for law professors especially, we have a tendency to get siloed, and this is a space where you really don't want to be siloed. You want to be trying to follow as much public health literature as you can, trying to follow a range of other sociological and social justice literature that just enriches our understanding of how all these phenomenons interact in important ways that obviously become legal issues. All right, so my last question.
Wait, can I just add one thing to that, Doug, that I wanted to say about the Oregon measure in Portugal that I think is a really important piece to look at, and what sets them apart a little bit in success, is that they don't, just what you said about like expanding how we look at it, neither narrowly looks at substance use disorder and drug treatment as the solution to the problem. Both say, it's pretty hard to treat substance use disorder or any condition if you don't have housing, or you don't have money to buy food or access to employment. So it looks at the type of services that the person can access, and that it looks to fund and provide much more holistically as what does this individual need to actually become well or to start leading a healthier life, rather than sort of a drug court model where it's like you can just access drug treatment, but you might be homeless, in which case you're not going to be able to, successfully recover. So both have that component, and I think set them apart in their ability to ultimately be successful.
Wonderful. Thank you for that point. And I'm going to wrap up with what is a question I've been thinking a lot about lately, and I'll give my answer to it at the start to give everybody else a chance to think about as well, in terms of, as we think about the drug war, and especially as we imagine trying to end it or draw it down, we think about casualties. That's the war rhetoric. And we especially think, oh, yeah, the time at which a war has ended is when there's no more casualties on the battlefield, and especially when there are no more sort of soldiers, occupying the place where we're at war. Whether soldiers and casualties are the right metrics per se, or if there are parallel ones in the drug war, I'm not quite sure. But I'm always very interested, especially as we've seen at times, and I'm fearful we may see again soon with the new administration, we're ending the drug war, or let's not bring the drug war back. When if you actually look at metrics, it hasn't gone away, whether it's measured by people facing immigration consequences, getting deported because of a drug conviction, whether it's just the raw number of arrests, whether it's the number of people incarcerated, churning through our jails, paying fines and fees. That's one of the things that I've also been kind of becoming more attentive to as we move toward decriminalization models. If we're imposing fines and fees, and doing so, especially in racially disparate ways, socioeconomically disparate ways, that has its own sets of perverse realities. And so what are the metrics that you'd recommend that you yourselves tend to look at to be optimistic? And I'll give you the two that of late I've looked at the most, again, particularly with the focus on marijuana, that has made me optimistic, gives me a sense of being positive looking forward, though they may be hopefully not reaching their ends, but reaching a certain point. One is federal marijuana prosecutions. I don't think anybody's really reported on this story at great length, but as recently as around the time Washington and Colorado legalized, the feds were doing, and this is the Obama, administration feds, were doing close to 7,000 marijuana prosecutions per year with pretty relatively severe federal penalties. Now, those were people moving usually very large amounts of marijuana over the southern border, and so not low-level cases. But the fact that Washington and Colorado legalized seemed to have moved a lot of the production of marijuana, at least more legally, to the U.S., and that number's dropped. I think it's down to about 2,500. So it dropped almost sort of 70% in the number of persons being federally prosecuted for marijuana distribution offenses. That's a pretty big move away. A lot of forces explain that, but that's remained the case even after the Sessions Justice Department repealed the Cole memo and all the things that may have been one aspect of that going on. The other is we've finally seen a pretty significant downturn in overall marijuana arrests. I think we're down to about 550,000 nationwide when we were up to close to 750,000, even as medical reforms were churning forward. Now that's still 10,000 a week, which seems like a stunning amount given legal reforms and what we've now seen, and most of those are possession and arrest. But still, the number is going in a good direction, and that's a number I'm going to keep watching, as with the federal prosecution number. But there's a lot of other numbers out there, not just in the marijuana space, but in the drug space. Sort of free for all as we wrap up. We've only got 4 minutes left. What numbers do you watch on a regular basis that either make you encouraged or that you think we ought to be giving more attention to drive the data and concern ourselves with where it's going? Jump in, anybody.
Sure, so I'll go first. I watch the estimate of how much of the market is underground, which of course is a difficult statistic to get, but to the extent we can get it, it's very slowly moving. I think we're at 2/3 now is estimated to be underground in Massachusetts, which is a lot, of course. I mean, it takes a lot to move people over to the regulated market, but it's very slow and steady, and I find it optimistic.
So I would say probably the two things I look most at are sort of on the war against user side, just numbers of arrests for simple possession, because I think that really is sort of, to me, the core part of the story of like, how are we treating simple use? How aggressively are we enforcing possession? How many possession arrests do we have? And then on the sort of war against seller side, the federal sentences for federal drug prosecutions, because I think that is, you see those sentences, I think until we really see very significant reductions in those sentences for federal distribution offenses, I would have a hard time saying like the war on drugs is anything close to over. I could imagine saying, well, the war on drugs is done, but we still have criminal laws against distribution because we have not legalized all drugs. But as long as we have this 1980s style mandatory minimums and similar sentencing guideline ranges, obviously, advisory guidelines, but those kinds of sentences, which see at the federal level, I think we still are sort of in the war on drugs era as far as I'm concerned.
Well, these are less trends, but just numbers that make me feel good that I look to when I need a boost. One is the number of reduction arrests, like California's law, which has had, 1 million issues on implementation times 10. If you look at the numbers of felony arrests in California for marijuana, the California law changed a lot of felonies to misdemeanors or eliminated them, and they've gone down dramatically. Still terrible disparities and worsening disparities in the number that exists, but just the number of individuals across the board arrested for felonies has gone way down. Another provision, and Illinois had something similar, where a chunk of tax revenue went directly to community-based nonprofit organizations. So you can actually look up and see, this organization got $200,000, this organization got $50,000, and that's just dollars going directly back into nonprofit organizations that are doing work in communities in a way that tax revenue doesn't often run directly to community-based nonprofit organizations. And then I'll just say that number that came out from Illinois on the pardons and expungements was pretty awesome at the end of the year that Deborah mentioned.
Right, and I guess I'll close out by saying a lot of the things that have been mentioned are things I would look to, like arrest numbers and sentencing. I'm not an optimist by nature, but one of the things that sometimes I try to boost my spirits about this is just looking at public opinion numbers. And part of the reason for that, right, is because I'm not saying other areas of law are not largely public opinion driven, but between the fact that drug law tends to be state and the fact that drug law enforcement tends to be local, right? It's decisions of elected prosecutors. As public opinion shifts in the direction of thinking about substance use disorders and drugs as things other than just things we treat with criminal justice, that's heartening to me, because without that, I don't see how we get the changes that a lot of us want at all.
Can I just add that, so one area that I think we need dramatically more data around is the intersection of drug enforcement and policing, on like, why are people being stopped? What's the basis for the frisk? What's the outcome of the stop and frisk? Because there's such an intersection between war on drugs and drug possession generally being used as a tool of policing, but I don't think we have the data to demonstrate to what extent and how, and that I think is a piece that's really, really needed.
Yeah, I'm very confident we would need a whole other panel to go through all the data we need filled in to really tackle all of these sets of issues. But I wish I could have people applaud and we could hear it. There have been a bunch of comments that came in on the chat as we were wrapping up. And so I'll use that as the closest thing I have to suggest we've managed to engage each other as well as the community at large. And this is obviously a conversation not going away. A final thanks to all the panelists for terrific remarks, especially to Alex for putting this together in the first instance and allowing me to interlope and moderate. And I look forward to 2021 and beyond, continuing to talk about these topics, hopefully with the continued sort of positivity that we wrapped up with there. And have a great afternoon, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for participating as well.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.